The sun was setting over the quiet village of Ibino when tragedy struck. A brutal clash between Ibino and the neighboring village Itiam left 8-year-old Ifeoma without a family. Her parents were killed in the chaos, leaving her an orphan in a village that soon forgot about her. Orphaned, Ifeoma was forced to live alone in her parents' small isolated hut on the outskirts of the village. Her only source of survival was the small farmland her parents had left behind. Day after day, she toiled under sun, planting and harvesting crops to keep herself alive. The villagers barely noticed her existence, and for years, Ifeoma lived in lonely silence. As years passed by, Ifeoma grew into a stunning woman. Her beauty was impossible to ignore, and suddenly, the same people who never cared about her began to notice. Men, young and old, began to notice her, their eyes lingering, their words dripping with flattery. But Ifeoma was no fool. She saw through their false words and shallow gestures. She kept her distance, protecting her honor as fiercely as she protected her small plot of land. In Ibino, virtue was everything. The villagers held chastity in the highest regard. Women who were caught engaging in relations outside marriage were publicly disgraced. The law was strict and spared no one, not even a man who forced himself on a woman. Such a man was sentenced to death. This law protected Ifeoma, at least for a time, as no one dared to harm her no matter how tempted they were. But everything changed the day Prince Ikenna saw her. Prince Ikenna was the only son of King Amechi and Queen Ifeoma. He was handsome but arrogant. Ikenna was notorious for playing with women's hearts, promising them marriage only to abandon them once he had his way. No one dared to speak against him because he was the heir to the throne, and his parents refused to correct him. When Ikenna saw Ifeoma, he was captivated by her beauty. For days he pursued her, attempting to win her heart with sweet words and grand gestures. But Ifeoma rejected him at every turn. Knowing his reputation and wanting no part of it, the prince, unused to rejection, grew angry. Enraged by her rejection, he decided to take what he could not win. One quiet afternoon, while Ifeoma worked on her lonely farm, Ikenna cornered her. Ignoring her pleas, he forced himself on her. As he left, he warned her not to breathe a word of what happened to anyone or face their consequences. Devastated, Ifeoma gathered her courage and went to the palace to seek justice. She fell at the feet of the king and queen, recounting the horror of what their son had done. But instead of compassion, she was met with cruelty. The king and queen dismissed her claims, branding her a liar. They threatened her, warning that any attempt to speak out would bring ruin upon her. Even the chief priest was bribed to pervert justice. Days turned into weeks, and Ifeoma's pain only grew when she discovered she was pregnant. Desperate, she approached Prince Ikenna again, hoping he would take responsibility, but he denied it and threatened her again. Even Queen Ifeoma sent messengers to warn Ifeoma to stay silent and not ruin the prince's name. When the villagers found out about her pregnancy, they were shocked and angry. They were even more outraged when Ifeoma couldn't tell who fathered the child. They called her child a bastard and treated her with scorn. In Ibino, Such children were considered outcasts, and their mothers were shamed. Ifeoma cried every day, but she was too afraid to tell anyone the truth. However, some villagers who knew Ifeoma's virtuous character began to suspect something was wrong. Why couldn't she name the father of her child? It didn't make sense that Ifeoma of all people would suddenly break the village's strict rules. Was there a darker truth beneath her silence? These whispers reached the ears of the queen, who grew anxious. She knew that if the villagers discovered the prince's crime, there would be outrage, even rebellion. In her desperation, she hatched a sinister plan. The child must not live. One of the palace maids, burdened by guilt, approached Ifeoma's hut. She had overheard the queen's orders to kill her newborn child and could no longer bear the weight of such cruelty. In a hushed tone, she warned Ifeoma of the looming danger and urged her to run. "Save your child," she pleaded. "Leave Ibino tonight before it's too late." With trembling hands, Ifeoma packed her few belongings and set out into the darkness. Her heart pounded as she made her way toward the village border, hoping to reach Itiam by dawn. But she had never left Ibino before and knew little of what lay beyond its boundaries. By the time she reached the edge of the village, she found herself standing before the mighty river Banku, which served as a natural border between Ibino and Itiam. Its dark roaring waters stretched endlessly before her, reflecting the faint light of the moon. Exhausted and uncertain, Ifeoma thought of waiting until morning, when the fishermen and sailors would arrive. Perhaps they could help her cross. As she pondered her next move, a sudden noise from behind shattered the silence. She turned, and to her horror, saw the palace guards approaching with machetes in hand. Their faces were stern, their steps determined. They had found her. Desperate, Ifeoma fell to her knees at the riverbank. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her baby tightly. "Oh, River Banku," she cried, her voice shaking with fear and anguish. "I beg you, protect my child. Hide him from those who seek his death. Do not let him perish, and do not let those who hunt him escape your wrath." With a trembling heart, she kissed her baby one last time, and with all her strength, threw him into the river. The mighty waves roared in response, rising like a wall to cradle the child. Then, the water carried the child away, out of sight. The guards, furious that the baby had escaped, turned their blades on Ifeoma. They struck her down by the riverbank, and her blood seeped into the river. The guards returned to the palace, reporting to the queen that both Ifeoma and the child were no more. But when morning came, the people of Ibino awoke to a horrifying sight. The waters of River Banku, on the side belonging to Ibino, had turned a deep, haunting red. It flowed like blood, and the streams that fed from it carried the same cursed color. No one could drink, bath, or wash in it. The villagers, alarmed and confused, gathered at the riverbank. When they found Ifeoma's lifeless body by the riverbank, their grief and fear intensified. According to village tradition, The body of someone who had died in mysterious circumstances could not be brought home for burial. Her body was cast back into the cursed river, her final resting place. The villagers were left in mourning, but more than grief, they were gripped by fear. They whispered among themselves, trying to piece together the mystery. Who had killed Ifeoma? Why had the river turned red? Where was her son? And why had she been running that night? These unanswered questions haunted them day after day. Desperate for guidance, the people turned to their village priests, but he lied, claiming that the gods were silent. Fear and uncertainty spread like wildfire, and Ibino fell into chaos. The curse of the Red River brought unimaginable suffering. The villagers no longer had access to clean water. To survive, they were forced to sail across the cursed river Banku into Itiam, their former enemy's land, or trek through the treacherous forest bordering Ukwa village. Both paths were dangerous, filled with risks from wild animals and hostile strangers. Life in Ibino became unbearable. The once thriving village was now marked by despair, suspicion, and endless suffering. And while the people struggled to survive, the mystery of Ifeoma's death and her missing son loomed over them like a dark cloud.